The Democratic Party held their first presidential debates this week with some unexpected candidates rising and others falling. In the first debate on Wednesday, Senators Elizabeth Warren and Cory Booker, along with Julian Castro, did pretty well. Thursday night's debate featured former Colorado Governor John Hickenlooper and Senator Michael Bennet, kind of making up the bookends of the debate. Bennet got more airtime than Hickenlooper, but Senator Kamala Harris gained most of the headlines coming out of the debate. Patty, when my wife looked at all the different reports coming out of the debate, she said, what does this mean if Biden this or Harris that or anything else? And my answer was, it's June. It is June of 2019. We have a long way to go. So my personal opinion is that while it provided a lot of great political theater, what it means is very little. I could be wrong. What do you think?
I think it does make some people pay attention who might not have been paying attention before because it's easy. So Wednesday night, just because of luck in the draw, it looked like Snow White and the Nine Dwarfs. Elizabeth Warren, who was the best, who's certainly polling pretty well and was doing very well recently, looked very reasonable up there. You could see people jockeying for position. Cory Booker was obviously, everyone who was speaking Spanish basically was jockeying for position. So there weren't a lot of surprises on that night, except maybe that Beto O'Rourke was as dull as he was. Last night's was the wild one. I thought, Kamala Harris has done very well in a lot of her public appearances. She's a good speaker, but I did not expect her to do quite as well as she did. She definitely stole the show last night. Whether or not you agree with her, she's a really good public speaker. She knew how to go on the offensive. She knew when to use a joke. We will not see any food fights at this table. She did a really good job. Hickenlooper was surprisingly lackluster. It could have been because of the rays of nuttiness coming at him from both sides, because he had the misfortune to be between Marianne Williamson and Andrew Wang, and that was definitely the wingnut side of the party. He only had, 5 minutes, I think. You could tell he was pushing his experience in Colorado. He got his talking points out there, scientist twice, never beer, which I think he should have poured out. He needed to put in the beer experience. But talked about Colorado and some of the gains Colorado had made. Bennet did okay. He went over, unlike Biden, who would give up his time, Bennet definitely grabbed every second he could. But I think the debates themselves, the technology was the biggest problem. The first night, things were going black. You couldn't see things. Last night, it was clear people couldn't hear the questions. And it was not just Biden and Sanders who couldn't hear it. I mean, there were people who just couldn't hear the questions. But those two wound up looking a lot more doddering than perhaps they really should have.
David, Bennet got, I think, about 8 minutes of airtime versus Hickenlooper's 5. Did either of them get, do you think, any sort of bump? The next debate, as I think it's laid out, is you need to be polling at 2% in order to get on the stage. And right now, I think there's about 7 candidates that meet the criteria, but that was before the debates. Do you see some momentum that either Michael Bennet or John Hickenlooper can glom onto after this debate?
Mis amigas en sus casas, quizás la hawaiana Tulsi Gabbard será la ganadora.
Anything further?
The challenge is there's a lot of candidates in the past. If you can be good at retail politics in New Hampshire and Iowa, you can break through there with a good finish. But the question is, can you survive long enough to get to New Hampshire and Iowa? And that is with these debate thresholds, that's the question for the lowest tier candidates, including Hickenlooper and Bennet. And I think of all that group, the one who helped herself the most was Tulsi Gabbard. She got lots of internet searches on her almost throughout the country. Cory Booker did well in the Southeast on internet searches, but she did very well elsewhere. She appeals to the same kind of voters to a degree that Rand Paul or Ron Paul appealed to in the Republican primaries. They don't mind internet, they're fine with international trade, but they're sick of so mmany troops being in so many countries, in so many wars for so long. Now you can argue for that as policy matter, but clearly that speaks to a strong view that a lot of people have. She's got military experience, and she articulated that point of view very well. And besides that, she, unlike a lot of the other ones, like, I mean, Bernie's just the old man yelling, "Get off all my lawn, you evil corporations." She has a very nice affect and a good style, and sort of that very positive, humanistic approach that Marianne Williamson brings without getting too much into new age fundamentalism. So if I were betting money on a long shot in the London markets, I would take odds on. I would put some money down on Tulsi Gabbard and put in $50. Maybe you get, I don't know, 201, and that she becomes president. For our Coloradans, I think they did respectably. They were both fighting in that sanity lane, which does not seem to be where the polls are indicating the party is at this point. Amy Klobuchar's in that to some degree. Tim Ryan from Ohio, John Delaney from Maryland were also working on that in the previous night. I think Bennet showed in the debate that if he were the nominee, he would have a good chance of beating Trump. And that's partly because he is wisely saying, I'm not going to get the nomination if it's this poisoned chalice that is going to make me unelectable in the general election. The point is not the honor of being the nominee. The point is of becoming president of the United States. So, for example, he opposes removing the criminal penalties for illegally entering the United States by crossing the border, rather than coming in properly. He also very accurately said that this Medicare for All thing, Bernie and Kamala, it's to wipe out people's health insurance, and that would be terrible. Hick did a good job too. I think he kind of fumbled on the climate. His climate answer, which he should have been stronger, but he also did a good job. Whether that's enough to make them leaders among the pro-sanity contingent, we'll have to see.
Natasha, seeing Bennett's performance, it seemed like there's a lane for him, whether it's fiery or the senator talking insanity, whatever it's going to be. I could at least imagine a lane. I don't see a lane for John Hickenlooper right now, and I could just be being dense about this. Admittedly, I am not looking at this 24 hours a day. Do you see a lane for John Hickenlooper right now?
No, I think then that's part of the problem. And I don't see a lane for many of the candidates that were on the stage. And I think that's what they're going to spend the next week or two probably really figuring out with their campaigns is how do we distinguish between this group that now the country has had an introduction to all of them? What makes me stand out? What is my lane? I do think Hickenlooper warmed up as the night went on. His initial questions were a little more shaky, but by the end I think he had hit his stride and felt a little bit more comfortable with what he was doing. Bennet, interestingly, I think stayed pretty focused on what his ultimate goal, but also what the party's ultimate goal is, which is to unseat Donald Trump. But Bennet extended that to realizing that this also means taking back the Senate. And that was a conversation that was slightly different than what a lot of the other candidates focused on. So I can see him drilling down on that more, because that question of not only how do we get someone in the White House, for Democrats, this is what they're asking, how do we get someone into the White House, but also how do we get the power to do what we want to do, because all of these healthcare proposals are fine and wonderful to talk about, but they're not going to happen unless they have the support to do it. So I think the nuance on that is something that Bennet will be able to excel at and sort of, I guess, lean into as he goes through the rest of the campaign. One of the things I did was look at how would any of these candidates, any of the ones that are on both nights, play in Colorado, because ultimately that's a question. And of course, we're going to spend time talking about our hometown favorites, but how would any of these people play on our political landscape? And I think that's going to be interesting. Healthcare, which I already mentioned, was a huge topic. Obviously, all the powers that have decided that that's the topic that we're going to spend the most of the time focusing on. But there are several others: immigration, the gap between the poorest in our country and the richest in our country. These are things we're going to hear more and more about. The moment of last night, which has been all over the news today, and I think will be a defining moment for Harris, was when she went after Biden to talk about his past work. What was interesting to me is a lot of people have talked about the diversity on the stage both nights, and in that moment, I was taken by the fact that we had a person speaking about how a policy made by another person on that stage affected them. And that age difference was something else, that generational difference. And we'll spend a lot of time in the next few months talking about electability, what it takes. Do we need someone who looks exactly like Trump? Do the Democrats want to find somebody who looks different? And I think Harris made an argument for what she would bring to the table against a Donald Trump ticket versus Joe Biden.